There was a time when television didn't treat folklore as something to be decoded. It didn't try to explain it, revise it, or apologise for it. Instead, it simply kept telling the story. And Dick Turpin belongs to that moment. By the time the series began in the late 1970s, Turpin was already a familiar figure, not a historical personality in any meaningful sense, but a folk presence. He was a name or a role, a shape that audiences recognised long before they encountered any particular version of the story. The series doesn't try to correct that. It doesn't attempt historical realism, nor does it worry about accuracy. Its interest lies elsewhere. This is folklore sustained by repetition. Each episode of Dick Turpin returns to a known pattern: the road, the horse, the outlaw, moving between authority and freedom, justice and self interest. The pleasure isn't surprise, it's recognition. Turpin himself is not treated as a psychological puzzle. He doesn't undergo deep personal transformation. He isn't slowly unmasked or dismantled. He remains. That stability is the point. In many later dramas, character development becomes the engine of meaning. People change, learn, or break down. Progress is equated with growth. Dick Turpin works on a different assumption. Here, the figure stays essentially intact while the stories accumulate around him. Each episode adds weight through familiarity, not revelation. This is myth functioning as television once understood it, not as an idea to be examined, but as a role to be performed again and again. The outlaw tradition has always worked this way. Robin Hood, highwaymen, tricksters and bandits, they survive because they are repeated. The series doesn't ask whether Turpin is a hero or a villain in modern moral terms. That ambiguity is already built into the folklore. Instead, it allows him to move through a world where authority is unreliable, justice is flexible, and loyalty is situational. The stories reset, the world continues, and importantly, the series never feels the need to justify this structure. There is no meta commentary, no irony, no apology for telling a familiar story yet again. That confidence is easy to miss because it became so rare so quickly. By this time, British television was already beginning to change. Narratives were tightening, genres were becoming more clearly defined. Repetition started to look like stagnation rather than tradition. But Dick Turpin still belongs to an older mode of thinking, one in which folklore was understood as something that only survives through use. You don't preserve it by locking it away. You preserve it by telling it again. That's why this series matters in the context of Richard Carpenter's work. Earlier programs explored myth as collision or coexistence, old worlds meeting new ones, past and present, rubbing against each other. Dick Turpin does something quieter. It shows myth being maintained. Here, folklore isn't disruptive, it's stabilizing. The repetition itself becomes the meaning. Children watching the series weren't being asked to decode symbolism or absorb lessons. They were being inducted into a pattern, a rhythm of storytelling that had existed long before television and would, in theory, continue after it. This is why the series doesn't chase novelty. New characters appear, situations change, but the underlying shape remains recognizable. The road always leads somewhere familiar. Authority always proves compromised. Turpin always occupies the space in between. That middle ground is essential. The outlaw myth only works if it remains unresolved. Once fully moralized, once turned into pure heroism or outright villainy, it collapses. Dick Turpin preserves that balance by not insisting on answers, and that restraint is part of a wider confidence that children's television once possessed. The assumption was that young viewers could live with contradiction, that they didn't need everything resolved or explained. That familiarity was not the same as boredom, but over time that assumption eroded. Television increasingly prioritized novelty. Series were expected to escalate, reinvent, or conclude. Repetition began to feel like failure rather than tradition. Folklore under those conditions became something else. It was either reimagined with heavy irony or isolated as event drama. It stopped being something you simply return to. Dick Turpin sits on the other side of that shaft. It doesn't reinterpret the myth, it doesn't modernize it, it doesn't apologize for its simplicity. Instead, it trusts the form. Week after week, it performs the same essential gesture. Here is the outlaw again, moving through the same moral landscape, reminding the audience of a story they already know. That's not laziness, it's maintenance. And maintenance is a concept television has largely forgotten. In a culture obsessed with reinvention, the idea of keeping something alive by repetition can look small, even conservative. But folklore doesn't survive through innovation alone. It survives because it is told and told again until it becomes part of the furniture. That's what Dick Turpin does. It keeps a folk figure in circulation, not as a museum piece, not as a parody, but as a living role performed regularly without commentary. In doing so, it represents a stage in a broader arc of mythic television writing, one where myth is no longer strange or disruptive, but still meaningful. Later television would either abandon this mode or radically reframe it. The repetition would stop, the rhythm would break. What remains looking back is not nostalgia for a specific series, but recognition of a lost confidence. The belief that stories didn't always need to move forward, that sometimes they only needed to continue. Dick Turpin didn't try to reinvent myth. It understood that its job was simpler than that. It kept the legend going. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed that. I will be back with another TV show another time. Bye.